Hello. In this video, we're going to go through some of the helpful pieces of background info and just some good historical information that will help us better understand of Mice and Men as we're reading it. So here you can see I have this nice picture of Mice and Men. Here is George and here is Lenny, who we'll meet in chapter 1. Okay, to start, this is John Steinbeck. I just want to give you a quick picture of him. He is considered one of the most important of American authors, so he's a pretty big deal. You guys will probably run into other novels that I've written later in high school. Or when you're in middle school, you might have read The Pearl or The Red Pony. Those are pretty classic Steinbeck novels or novellas as well. So he grew up in the Salinas Valley, California, where that's where he grew up. And you can see here, this is where it is in California. So remember, California is this giant state over here in the west. And right here we have Salinas and Soledad, which is where a lot of our novel takes place, is right around there. So in the summers, he would work as a ranch hand, which is the job of George and Lenny in this novel. So when they're ranch hands, Steinbeck knows all about that because he was one. So his novels captured what life was like in the Salinas Valley. So here's another image of just kind of that landscape, what that looks like. Okay, with the publication of this first novella, is in a short novel of Mice and Men in 1937, he gains worldwide recognition. So it's a pretty big deal. As you can see here, some different covers of that. So again, we have Lenny, we have George, right? You guys might have, I think you probably have a cover similar to this or slightly different. Okay, so Mice and Men is a frequently banned book. Okay, so banned books mean that it is not in a certain library, or you weren't supposed to read it in certain areas. And so what makes it so controversial, right? What makes people want to ban it and censor it? Well, it's the fact that partially because of its language. So you can see here some examples. All of these different pieces of language you're going to encounter in the book. And worse, honestly. So we see a lot of this kind of nasty language in there. Of Mice and Men is also controversial because of the way it depicts women. So it doesn't depict women very kindly. It was a sign of the times, as well as it gives us a little bit of a look into how hard women's life was at that time. It's also censored because it shows behaviors that many consider crude. So we're talking about drinking, smoking, general debauchery is in general not great behavior. So why are we reading it? Well, it has a lot of universal themes, as in those messages that it's good for us to reflect on and learn as we go through society. It has a great depiction of others. So what that means is that, like we saw with the short stories we read at the beginning of this year, the depiction of others is in their perspective, right? People that are treated as outsiders in society for things that they have no control over, or that they shouldn't be treated that way for. And it has a killer twist ending. So it'll really grab you at the ending. Okay, next, so this takes place in the 1930s. Okay, before the 1930s, farm life was booming in America. So you can see we have these different pictures here of what life was like at the time. With the invention of better tractors, farmers could go crazy plowing the land, and they did. Right? They didn't have to do it all by hand, so they could use the tractor. So they plowed all the land. Unfortunately, they didn't know a lot about soil conservation. And so when the crops failed year after year because of a drought, there was nothing holding the soil in place. And what happens when loose dirt is in a big wind? We get the dust storm. So the prairie winds made many dust storms, and you can see here, and there are some other pictures we're just going to look at here really quickly. We've got this huge cloud, and actually this kind of reminds me of the smoke that we've seen in Colorado recently, but you can see these huge dust storms, and they're not smoke, this is just dust from all of the dirt from the crops that was kind of pulled up because they overworked the soil, and then there was a drought. So we have this huge dust storm. And we know better now, so we're more strategic in the way that we plant crops and things like that to avoid having these huge dust storms. So they refer to it as Black Sunday on April 14th, 1935. It's the dust storm that turned day into night. Many believe the world was coming to an end because of this. So here's another one of Boise City, Oklahoma, this dust storm. You can see, just imagine this wall coming towards your house. Here's primarily where the dust storm took place. Okay, you can see a little bit in Denver, a lot in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. So people would actually, they would try and seal the doors of their houses with cloth, with clothing, with towels, and things like that to keep the dust from getting in their house. But it would anyway. The dust would get into their house. They would even, they called it sweeping the air. They'd take like a wet canvas bag and drag it through the air to catch some of the dust that was in the air. People would tie bandanas over their nose and mouth, which actually reminds me of right now as well. And so they'd cover their faces to try and keep the dust out and to keep their lungs free of dust. Kind of like we wear masks today, but not for dust, for COVID. You can see here, like a lot of their possessions were buried. They're trying to dig things out. It was just insanity. So imagine trying to live in these conditions. So the dust storms lasted from 1931 to 1939. So it was getting into their food, into their water, into their bodies. Farmers and their families had to leave. They couldn't stay. They didn't have food, they didn't have water, they didn't have a way to make a living. So they had to sell everything. You can see here there's an evacuation sale. They took to the road, and where indeed did they go? So here's an example of what a kind of common family, some of the conditions they were having to face as they got on the road. Not really ideal. So they went to California. They traveled west to California. California had great farmland and no dust, so they migrated. That left many farm laborers and ranch hands traveling the roads in search of work, and that's where we find George and Lenny in chapter 1, as they're traveling on the road along that Salinas River to find work. So these are the types of characters that Steinbeck writes about. So as I said, George and Lenny, these are his types of characters. You can see a picture here of what they looked like, oftentimes what they carried with them. So you can remember they talk about in chapter 1 a bindle, and it's probably their pack that they're carrying with them. So a blanket, a pillow, any personal effects that they would have with them, they would have in their little bindle and they'd carry with them. So during the time Steinbeck was writing of Mice and Men, it was also in the time of the Great Depression. So you can see here lots of people were out of work, people were going hungry. It's obviously not a great time. You can see here free coffee and donuts for the unemployed. People lined up like crazy. There were lots of unemployed workers. So it was very important that people, if they had a job, that they keep it. Okay, so again, here's a picture. This is what I showed you in class last week. We have the picture of the Salinas River area in California. This is where Steinbeck grew up and worked on ranches. And into this area came many of these jobless men in the 1930s. So this is where George and Lenny came. And this is right around the Great Depression, so it was important that they got a job. It was important that they made the most of what they were doing. It was a pretty big deal to be able to own your own land, and they didn't at that point. And you'll know they talk about it in chapter 1 and chapter 2, their desire to own their own land. And that was a pretty far off goal, something they were really reaching for, and maybe might not ever get to because of the Great Depression and because of the Dust Bowl and all of these things that had kind of wreaked havoc on their lives. So with that, I hope you guys have a better understanding of the background knowledge and the historical context for this novel of Mice and Men. Good luck.